there's such a value in having organic and yet data-driven conversations. But I try and filter that through, is this a Krista curiosity? Is this just something I want to know and that I'm like itching to get my hands on? Or is this something that's going to serve my audience at the end of the day?
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, podcaster, it's your host, Adam Adams, and we are with Krista Reuther, right?
Nailed it. Yes,
oh my gosh.
You did it.
It only took like 17,000 takes. Anyway, it's so good to have you. I was listening to your podcast episode about the Trump presidency. I know we don't want to always get political, but your podcast is about landlords. It helps people who are buying rental properties, and depending on really if there's a Democrat or a Republican, we will see different laws going in. So it makes sense that you had that. And I wanted to find out, you've done about give or take 50 episodes in this podcast. You've got another one with a few less. And what have you learned along the way? What have you learned that you can help a brand new podcaster, somebody who's 2 years or less, maybe they're about to start? What have you learned over the last 50, 60 episodes that you want to give to that person?
So much. I mean, first and foremost, I think having a very clear vision for what you want to talk about is going to obviously shape how often you film, what kind of setup you're filming in, whether it's really conversational like our shows are, or something more polished and very buttoned up. It really depends on who your end audience is. But with that, I think having a certain degree of flexibility with your audience and understanding who they are as they interact with your content makes you the best possible podcast host. So don't be so married to your vision that you ignore different opportunities and lose the kind of playful side of podcasting, but have something that tethers you so that when you are experimenting with different things, like we don't typically cover politics at our channel level, but given the current events, it seemed like we really needed to. So having that room to experiment and saying, all right, I'm going to give it a whirl. I'm going to measure my metrics. I'm going to examine those afterward and see if this was worth it. And then make a decision about whether or not I touch these kinds of topics again is going to lead to a really successful long-term podcast.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff. I mean, having a clear vision is crystal, it's so important regardless, I should say, if we are in a relationship, if we are starting a business, a school, a not-for-profit, or a podcast. Mm-hmm. Having a clear understanding and idea of what it is that we want to accomplish. And then you also talked about with your podcast, it being, some podcasts, they might want it to be more conversational, while others might want it to be more polished. Mm-hmm. And the third point that I heard you share is one that we talk about a lot on this show. And it's really just understanding and knowing your avatar inside and out, really understanding who they are, what they're looking for, what they want, what keeps them up at night, so that you can put the absolute best content for that person. Do you feel, I want you to think of a mistake. Think of something you did wrong along the way. Maybe with the avatar, but it could be anything. In your journey of 50, 60, 70 episodes so far with one or two podcasts, what is something that you learned because you did it wrong the first time?
Something that immediately jumps out. So our two podcasts, one is the Be a Better Landlord show. One is Adventures in Landlording. I'm going to talk about Be a Better Landlord here for a second. That's where we bring in expert guests, so people in the industry, to offer insights to our audience via a very conversational format. One time, we had a really lovely local industry expert reach out. She wanted to be on our podcast. This was early days. We really hadn't had many guests yet. So we said, oh, of course, I did my research. I looked at her LinkedIn. I looked at her network connections. I was like, okay, this should be a really great guest. Like, I've never heard her speak. She's not really been on a podcast before, but like, this should be really good. My coworkers had talked to her, the whole 9 yards. I'm laughing because we get into the studio, and unfortunately, for as sweet of a woman as she was a terrible guest. She actually was not the expert in what she claimed to be an expert in. And it became very clear through my line of questioning that she just could not offer some of these very basic answers that an expert should have been able to offer. It was a huge learning lesson because in that moment, I could either scrub the entire episode and just say, thank you for coming in. Here's a complimentary hat. Please see yourself out. Or I could find something that she was an expert in and give her the opportunity to really shine in that realm, even though it was not what I was planning for the episode. I tend to be someone who looks for constructive solutions to problems. So I said, all right, let's pivot. I know that you're an expert in this topic that I saw you wrote a blog on. It's not what we were planning to talk about today. Would you be interested in going down this route? And she was really excited because she had obviously been feeling very embarrassed when she couldn't answer some of the basic questions I was asking. So we just took a breath, took it from the top, and recorded a really solid episode on something entirely different than what we were originally intending to cover. So the main takeaway, my apologies.
Yeah, I was going to ask you this because I brought on somebody in a similar fashion where I was thinking to myself, man, this person, I'm not going to say whether it's a guy or a girl or a
Sure.
he, she, it, them, whatever. This person definitely didn't know a lot of the content that I thought they wanted to be the expert about.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it a different way. And so I want you and I to both talk about these things. I did it a slightly different way. I found out while we were recording, and I'm thinking to myself, how do I change this? So I asked a couple of questions, and then I found something while we were going that he or she or they or them or it was able to feel comfortable speaking on. So we stayed on that for a little while. And I remember, to be honest, thinking that was really frustrating to interview this person. I didn't like it. And now this person sounds like a total expert. And I wasn't even sure if I liked them, but it worked out because we were able to switch the gear to the thing that he, she, they, or it was able to talk on. And you did it a different way. It sounds like, when did you find this out? While you were recording? Before you were recording? Okay, she's nodding yes. So
Yeah.
While you were recording, you figured it out, but then you pushed pause, and then what happened?
Pushed pause. I didn't want to embarrass her because we still had 45 minutes of filming scheduled. And at the end of the day, I needed to make an episode. We had been slated for this particular conversation. So I went back to my research because I always make sure to research my guests before they come on. This, however, was an exercise in really knowing what to prioritize when you're researching a guest. Because I looked at her kind of through a broad lens of who does she know? What does she do? What has she produced? When really I should have looked out for her specific expertise in the topic that she was pitching herself for, because she hadn't put out as much content about that. Certainly nothing that would have given me an indication that she was truly an expert. So because I had done my research and I saw other things that she had covered and that she seemed pretty confident in, just said, all right, we've taken a beat, we've taken a breath, taken some water. Let's actually pivot to this topic instead. And she was elated, right? She still wanted to be on the podcast, wanted to participate. And I would say, maybe with rose-colored glasses on, she really wanted to give me something that was usable and helpful for my audience. But I had to redirect her into a way that could actually be accomplished outside of how she had pitched herself, because clearly the way that she had pitched herself did not match up with what she could deliver.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, knowing your avatar, that being one of the critical pieces that we need to do if we're going to have something successful. And your avatar, and you knew, hey, this is the topic that is going to work. And it sounds like the only reason that you really knew that is because you took the time ahead of time, like before you even had this person in the studio to study some things, some other content that they put out. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I would highly recommend anyone who's new to the space, or even just someone who's bringing on guests for the first time, keep an eye on who you're platforming and what they're actually saying in their own content and how that's going to play to your avatar.
So what types of people do you have on your podcast? Well, you have two podcasts. So this podcast that we're talking about, who do you have on the show and how does it help your perfect avatar?
First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the perfect avatar because I think that'll inform who we bring on. So perfect avatar is, either an aspiring housing provider or someone who is already in the game. Maybe they have 1 to 3 rental units. They are trying to build a good business and they want to be good landlords. So with that in mind, we bring in industry experts from all realms that touch the housing market. We've had lenders on, we've had people who conduct 1031 exchanges, which is a tax code that allows you to switch out properties. It's so fun and fresh. It's just as exciting as I'm delivering it right now. But then also people like real estate agents and folks who work with specific types of investors, like military investors, just trying to give as much of a full picture on different avenues and shedding light on common issues that folks are facing when they're building up these businesses.
Yeah. And what types of questions are you asking? And I'm going to preface this. So you might even take some time to write down these questions if you want to, but I want to share in many spaces, people who have a podcast, they might ask their guest just anything that they, the host, are interested in, which means that they forgot their avatar. And so they're asking things like, hey, I want to know this, but they forgot to think, what does my avatar want to know? Or they will think that their avatar has listened to all 1,000 of their episodes so far and knows all of the basics of these things. And then they get in and they bring in somebody who is really, 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 really high level, like a different type of expert, where it's niche and nuance. And they'll ask things that are like black belt level, right? Ninja strategies or something that goes over the head of the true avatar. And it's because the host wants to learn that, or the host maybe got bored of serving their true avatar. And with that in mind, how do you figure out, or what kind of questions do you ask that help you serve your avatar better?
First, I actually go to my guest and I say, what is your passion? What are you excited to talk about? And then they give me their answer, and I use that to really shape how our conversation is going to go. So taking their passion as a starting point and then filtering it through the lens of what I've seen my avatars asking, the kind of content that resonates with them. Now, I do have a bit of a leg up because in addition to co-hosting these podcasts, I also run original research. So I do a lot of survey projects of our audience. And that means that I can get into their minds a little bit more and say, okay, this is where they are indicating that they have the most questions. These are commonly asked things throughout that survey. How can I weave in these data-driven insights with a conversational tone and this expert? Yeah. And I use all of those factors to create a guided conversation, question and answer based. And it's been really successful thus far because we're delivering the kind of educational content people are looking for based on what they're actually asking for.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Question, you mentioned that you have an idea of where the conversation is going to go. So you've got a few pieces of data, statistics that you found, you've looked up, things that you know your avatar, your listener wants to know already. And you ask questions kind of in this direction. Now, here's the question for you. When you do that, when you're asking questions to your avatar, do you just ask a question, have them answer it, and then you ask your other question, have them answer it, and you ask your other question, and have them answer it? Or do you find time to go deeper and do follow-up questions when you're on a topic? Which do you do? Why or why not?
I love letting a conversation go deeper, right? I think that there's such a value in having organic and yet data-driven conversations. But I try and filter that through, is this a Krista curiosity? Is this just something I want to know and that I'm like itching to get my hands on? Or is this something that's going to serve my audience at the end of the day? Luckily, I've had enough experience and I've been in touch with this audience and my avatars enough to have a pretty good sense of what's going to tickle both of our fancies. But I do believe in letting the conversation play out organically as much as possible and asking follow-up questions, especially when, and I'm sure you've had this happen, a guest says something and it's like, I think we are 3 steps away from that being such a good nugget of information. And I just have to peel back a couple of those layers to get there. I'm ready to do it. My hands are built for peeling. I just get in and start. And that has produced really interesting clips that then can be reused on social. So there's a lot of value in following your gut, especially if you are a good conversationalist and doing the work to get to those organic pieces that you might have missed otherwise.
Love it. How about when you are figuring out who to bring on? Do they reach out to you? Do you reach out to them? And how do you kind of vet your guest?
I am blessed in this space where it's a bit of a mix. We have people who reach out who get pitched either by their own agencies or they'll write me directly and say, Krista, I think I'd be a good fit for this show. And I also do a fair amount of outreach as well. So just seeing different podcasts popping up, seeing where audiences could align, or when there's even just a sliver of alignment, but they have a brand new group that I could speak to. That's sometimes my favorite situation, to get in front of new folks. And then to vet them, I like to ask what kind of podcast they've been on previously. That's a big indicator. I like to sit down and listen to a couple of interviews and see how it plays out. Not everyone who is an expert is a good interviewer. And you have to weigh out, the manner in which they deliver information versus the information that they hold, and if they can actually effectively communicate with your audience. From there, I also look at their social media. I look at their website. I ask questions about what CTAs they want to make sure that it all aligns with our brand, our vision. And then we move forward. We have a great conversation, and usually it ends with smiles and handshakes. So can't really complain.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned as well that you try to keep your content data-driven, which is something that I know is very valuable. I hear a lot of people. I am on a fitness journey, just to give that to you real quick.
Sure.
And what's unfortunate is within that space, there is so much arguing there. And by that, I mean, nobody seems to agree on something. Mm-hmm. For example, people think, fruit is one of the best things ever, and you should have as much fruit because it has fiber, it has vitamins and minerals, it has your water. And so if you're eating fruit, then you get all these things. And then we have people saying, never eat any type of carbohydrates ever, including any fruits. A banana or a blueberry or watermelon or whatever is just full of sugar, and sugar is bad and it spikes your insulin, and that's going to keep you fat, and that's going to whatever. And the best way is to avoid all carbs. And we can dive into this, and we hear people arguing about, this is how you lift. No, this is how you lift. This is the best kind of cardio. No, this is the best kind of cardio. And what's sad is that we know that many of them, we'll just call it 95% of them, we'll just pretend that's the number for a minute.
Sure.
They just share things that they heard on social. They just share things that their friends said, but they don't really know about it. They don't really know the ins and outs about that thing. And that could go with what you have. You help people with landlording. And there are some nuances. I saw one of your episodes was about marijuana. Like, what's the legal way to have this? Can they smoke or use marijuana in your property or not? some of these things, it is city driven, state driven, country driven, whatever. So you've got people listening that might be in a different county, or for example, Colorado was one of the first to say, "Hey, we're not going to criminalize you if you do anything with marijuana." And when we think about this stuff, when we think about what people are learning, what people are hearing, it gets crazy. And so I'm hearing you say that you are pulling in the data on purpose. And I appreciate that, because when I think about the health and fitness and I can find 10 answers for the same thing, is an almond good for me? It's going to be like, no, they're poisonous, or no, they have too much fat and you're going to get fat, or yes, they're good for you because they have fat and you're not going to feel hungry for a while. It's just too much, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the person who has real hard data on this information. And it's like, yeah, this is what you should do in that situation. So I appreciate that. And I want the listener to be thinking about, hey, on my podcast, I'm going to do what Krista does. I'm going to find the real data, and I'm not just going to bring up what I heard on social or what my best friend said. That's all really good stuff. And now I want to ask about stories.
Yeah.
Recently on this podcast, we've had a few guests talk about ways that they can weave in stories. And I'm curious with you, with your guests, what do you do about stories? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they a waste of time? Please come from there. What do you think for stories?
I think stories are critical. I think that's ultimately why most people tune into podcasts. And the best podcasts have a balance between data and, some of the drier pieces of information, depending on, what your audience is, what your purpose is with your podcast. But certainly in my space, there's plenty of dry and, uneventful podcasts. But when you bring in that human element and firsthand account, secondhand account of how, these numbers or these concepts play out in real life, you're not only engaging the listener, but you are actively building something that they can remember long term. Because if I tell you the number of states that require rent receipts, one, very boring, but two, why do you care? Now, if I tell you the story of a landlord who was fined $50,000 because he wasn't sending rent receipts, you're going to remember that a lot more quickly. It's going to come to mind. It's going to be right there for you. So I think we can't discount the value of stories. And so often, data and story weaving, that goes together naturally. Like when you have a set of data and you're just looking at it dry, you're not doing yourself a service by leaving it in that form. You need to attach it to something meaningful. And most often, that's people's firsthand accounts with it. So highly, highly recommend stories.
I've done a number of coaching calls and discovery calls. Discovery calls, for the listener, to me means it's kind of like a sales call. I'm going to see if you're the right fit for us working with you, and you can see if we're the right fit for us to serve you. And in those calls, when I first started, I had calls and people would ask me a question. I would just give them an answer. And then they would hire me, and then they would do something completely opposite from that answer. And I always wondered, this happened many times, Krista, and I always wondered, why the heck did they ask me if they weren't going to listen? And on the second time that I talked to him, when I said, you're effing up, I'm like, hey, this is what one of my clients did. This is what happened to them. And that's why you need to be thinking about this. And they're like, oh, well, why didn't you just say so? So I started using stories just in my podcast to kind of answer those questions earlier. And on the discovery call, when somebody says, hey, what about this? Then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go into the same story. And the cool thing is they make the mistake a lot less. So your $50,000 landlord story for not getting a rent receipt is a really good example to, hey, am I in one of those cities or not that I have to be doing that? Let me ask you this, Krista, for kind of switching gears. Your podcast is for landlords, but there are many types of landlords in many cities. And I'm thinking, so for me, I've bought a lot of apartment buildings with something called syndication with partners.
Yeah.
I have done a house hack where or I guess it was a apartment hack. I bought a multi-unit and I lived in one of the units.
Yep.
And I even manage property right now for a friend of mine. So I have done or been involved in many different types of landlording. And I'm curious if we can select the type of landlord that should listen to your show. Which am I going to get value from your show if I am syndicating? Am I going to get value from your show if I'm a mom and pop? Tell me, who is it really for? Which landlord?
I'd say first and foremost, that mom and pop landlord is going to have the most to gain from our show because it's really tailored to that particular avatar. However, and this could be incredible bias on account of how much I love our shows, I truly do believe there's something for everyone involved in real estate investing. We've designed it to be very purposeful in educating folks about various issues that pop up, whether you're only as involved as your investment is. If you're syndicating, you're putting money into something that someone else is managing. But you should still know how fair housing laws work, because at the end of the day, you could still see repercussions as a syndicator, even if they'd be less or different than what a mom and pop landlord would see for the same kind of situation. So everyone can benefit, but largely residential mom and pop landlords, the bulk of the content is specifically for them. Other folks can benefit too.
Okay. Yeah, I have two avatars for this show. I have the main avatar, which has already been podcasting for a while, but they're not getting the results that they were hoping for. And so they're starting to feel like this is a waste of time. Should I stop it? Or how can I get it to do something before I stop it?
Mm-hmm.
And then I've got my secondary avatar, which is somebody who's about to launch their very first podcast, and they just don't want to make the mistakes that somebody else had made. And so I try to be conscious to speak to both of them and even to say, like, this is for you if you're about to launch, or this is for you if you've been doing it for a while, but nothing's working. And then I might even talk to the other avatar. This is for you if you have been doing it for a while, but it isn't really working for you. And hey, if you haven't even launched, it's even better that you're listening now, right? So I kind of tried to do that. And you've got that main avatar, and then you've kind of got your secondary avatar, which will still get a lot of value. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to a question that I'm curious on with you having two different shows. I want to know, why is there two different shows? I'm going to ask like a 17-part question. Why the heck do you have two shows? Is it hard? Is it easy? Do you feel like you want to murder yourself because it's too crazy? And also, is this for the same exact person? And if it is for the same avatar, why isn't it just one show? So do what you can to keep up with all the multi questions. But I'm curious, why two shows?
Love a $1 million multi-part question. So first and foremost, I would say the avatars for each show are slightly different. Is there overlap? Absolutely. But the main purpose of Be a Better Landlord is really to serve that primary avatar, the people who are mom and pop landlords. Of course, there are other folks who gain value from it as well. I would also say, and don't tell them I forgot them, but people who are aspiring landlords often tune into that show to say, okay, this is what I need to know to build a good business from the ground up, similar to your secondary avatar. Adventures in Landlording is it's still going to be fun for people who are involved in the housing providing market side of things, right? They are people who own properties, but it's also open enough that people who are renters can tune in and feel heard. And that is by design. So where Be a Better Landlord is really education focused, where we're walking through specific issues, Adventures in Landlording is more freeform. So we pull stories from across the internet of either landlord misdoings or tenant misdoings, even just issues of communication and setting proper expectations. And then we talk through it with a lens of being rental experts. So we can sit down and say, hey, we see that there's a situation. Actually, we just filmed an episode earlier today where A mom is on a mortgage with her son. Mom let the cousins come and rent out the property. Cousins have refused to have any kind of rent increases since 2020, and now son wants to come back and move into the property. What do you do? And it's such a specific situation, but we know the laws. We know how to peel that back and say, okay, this is not an ideal situation. This is not good if you're trying to set up a business, but here's exactly what you would need to do in order to move forward and reclaim your property. And that's interesting both to landlords and housing providers, but also to renters. And sometimes renters tune in because they love to hate on landlords. And granted, I do fully believe that landlords and tenants are less volatile, and there's less friction there than you would assume, especially when I look at it on an individual level with my surveys. Most people like each other, surprise. But in mass, when there are stories about landlords acting up or tenants squatting, each side wants to go and weigh in. So that's kind of a more fun, still education inspired, but really looking for that back and forth and dissecting real stories as they happen sort of situation.
Yeah, I have an idea of this, and I'm curious if it's right. So the listener might be like, so what do you do? Are you allowed to kick them out or not? I would have thought that, if you're in a contract, that you just say, hey, the contract is ending at this time, and if you'd like to stay, this will be the new level of rent. I wouldn't think that it would be easy to get rid of cousins to bring in son again. I don't think it sounds very easy if the rent isn't going to also increase. So what's the answer to that?
Well, the answer to that, first and foremost, is taking a look at the original lease agreement, because they had signed a lease back in 2020. However, they never re-signed a lease. Many leases have some kind of clause that say, hey, if nothing's re-signed, this transfers into a month-to-month. And once it's a month-to-month, there are different laws about how long you have to give notice before you say, hey, we're not renewing this. So this particular story took place in Michigan. Once a month-to-month lease is coming due, or you want to end the arrangement in Michigan, you have to give at least 30 days notice. It has to be written. It has to be delivered in a specific way. But you tell them at least 30 days out, hey, we are not renewing your lease. You will need to find somewhere new to live. And that is a perfectly viable option. So it's about having tough conversations and making sure that your lease is really buckled into whatever might come up. You really want as robust a lease as possible to try and cover all your bases. But if you have that in place and you know the laws, you can then execute pretty effectively.
I bought my first triplex back in 2007.
Wow.
Right before the crash. And
yeah.
I was thinking, I was such a dummy. I was thinking that a property manager would be a waste of time and money. I was thinking that, getting a contract written by an actual attorney would just be extra expense that I didn't need, because it was my first one. And I lost so much money by doing it that way. But by cutting costs, it ended up costing me a ton. So I would recommend, if you're listening and you're thinking about becoming a landlord for the very first time, definitely try to educate yourself. And Krista's got a couple of podcasts that we'll link to both of them in the show notes right now. So if you scroll down, you would be able to follow either of those podcasts and be able to hopefully stay out of some of the trouble that others can get in. Krista, for a podcaster who's listening, who's one of my two avatars, they've been doing it for a while and beating their head against a wall, or they never want to have to beat their head against a wall. They want it to be successful from the beginning. Is there one additional thing that you can think of that you want to share with somebody getting into podcasting?
Absolutely. I would say keep content repurposing top of mind, from the way that you structure your episodes to the channels that you release them on. What that looks like in practice here, we film, fairly sizable episodes, and by which I'm going to tell you and you're going to laugh, but our episodes range, Be a Better Landlord, or anywhere from 9 to 30 minutes long, and Adventures in Landlording, all said and done, is around 30 to 40 minutes long. So nothing like the behemoths that are out there, right? But still quite long. We film it all in one setup. Then what we do is afterward, we take a look and we say, okay, where can we cut out shorts for social media? Where are good 30 to 60 second clips that we can take out pointing back to our show? without having to refilm additional content. And that has enabled us to scale up our audiences pretty successfully with less lift. So keep content repurposing top of mind as you go.
Yeah. Kill two birds with one stone. Make sure you can, or 3 or 4.
Or 3, kill all those birds.
Love it. We're not going to have any birds left, but you will have a successful podcast for sure. Hey, if you're listening, the next episode that I have created is something that I know you need. So if you got a few seconds, I'll see you there. I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.